All right, what's going on, everyone? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So as Dominic mentioned, my name is Carter Rabassa, and I'm a product manager at Twilio. And thank you so much for joining my talk. I know this room is a little bit smaller than the other one, but that's great. It's cozy. It's a good audience. Thank you so much for joining. A little bit about the talk. This is a 30-minute, 100-level talk. So we're going to be covering information at a fairly high level, but hopefully you all walk away with something that you didn't know about building and debugging Twilio applications. For the most part, I'm going to be discussing working with the REST API and working with Twilio webhooks. Quick note about me, I am a product manager of the DevTools team. I'm going to explain a little bit about what the DevTools team does at Twilio in a second. You can email me, carter@twilio.com. That's not an empty statement. I sincerely would hope that if there's anything that you love about building and debugging with Twilio, or anything that you hate about building or debugging with Twilio, that you would reach out directly to me. It's more or less my only job. You can also find me on Twitter and GitHub at CRTR0. Where am I from? Does anyone here know what city this is?
Seattle.
Who said that? Good job. Awesome. This is Seattle. Twilio, as many of you know, is headquartered in San Francisco, but I work remotely from Seattle, so I'm one of Twilio's many remote employees. On the flight over to London, I was trying to think about how I would explain Seattle to all of you in a way that you could kind of walk away with an understanding of the city that I come from. And most of us here are developers, so we all understand the universal language of memes. So I tried to think of like the top 3 things that encapsulate Seattle. So the first thing that I thought of was hipsters. Seattle is littered with hipsters. But to be fair, walking around Shoreditch for a couple days, I think you might be there might be a bit of a competition between Seattle and London. I did not know that. Another thing, the rumors are true. It rains a lot in Seattle. But once again, after being in London for a couple days, I'm thinking to myself, hey, what's going on here? Maybe Seattle, maybe we're sister cities, right? But the last thing that you should really understand about Seattle, and this is where we diverge, is coffee. Coffee is its own food group. It's its own meal. However you feel about tea, Seattleites feel about coffee. I will say, though, that I'm quite impressed with the coffee that we have on service today. So kudos to the catering staff. About the DevTools team. So this is a relatively new team at Twilio. The way that we think about the tools that we own and operate is very similar to how many of you probably think about building software. From the moment that you have an idea that you want to start to prototype, all the way through deploying it to production and actually monitoring your production application operationally. So all of these tools are tools that we own. The first 3 I'm going to talk to about in this talk, because they're very useful in terms of building or debugging software. So agenda for the talk. I'm going to provide a very brief, high-level overview of Twilio's platform architecture, and then I'm going to go ahead and dive into some common REST API issues and some common webhook issues. So at a very, very high level, I'd like you to think about Twilio as this sort of hermetically sealed system that integrates with the outside world in 2 different ways. So what you see on the left is Twilio's connections and integrations with carriers around the world, Twilio's super network. This is exactly what Twilio does that makes it easy for you as developers to make and receive phone calls and send and receive text messages. The integration point that you see on the right is the integration point between Twilio and your software. And it's very important to note that this integration is taking place, or this communication is taking place over the public internet, which we'll get to in a minute. The kind of software that you write falls into 2 broad categories. One are server-side applications that you expose as web applications. The second are client applications that you write using Twilio SDKs, whether it's in JavaScript, iOS, or Android. I'm not going to cover building or debugging client applications in this talk, but I did cover it briefly in my talk at Signal San Francisco. So you can find that video and learn a little bit about some debugging best practices for SDK applications. But let's talk about the internet for a second. So when Twilio 1.0 was shipped, the Twilio platform was built on top of open web protocols and standards. And this was actually pretty novel back in 2008, and it turned out to be one of the best decisions that Twilio ever made, because it meant that tens of millions of web developers all over the world could almost overnight build Twilio applications using tools and programming languages and techniques that they were already familiar with. So this was amazing. This was uncategorically like a good decision. But there are downsides, right? And the downside is the fact that the public internet sits between Twilio and your software. So when a customer contacts you and says that the number that they called isn't working or the application that you built isn't working, the fault could be in your code, the fault could be in Twilio's code, but more often than not, the fault is in the fact that we are relying on the public internet. So all of the problems that you run into exposing applications to the public internet, you can run into when building Twilio applications. So this is the first thing that you need to consider when you're trying to debug things. The good news is that debugging can be easy. This is a quote from a sort of a tech hero of mine by the name of Dave Weiner. Dave Weiner more or less invented RSS and other open publishing protocols and standards. And Dave's insight here is pretty simple. The key to solving a problem, what might seem like a big problem, is to break it down into as many small problems as you can and test each of those small problems atomically. And that is a general principle for debugging, and it's very useful for debugging Twilio applications. So let's go ahead and dive into common REST API issues. Why is there a kid on the screen? I have two beautiful daughters. They always make it into my presentations. I don't know why Emily is screaming right now. I think I was trying to explain the difference between REST and RESTful, and she just went totally insane. So let's go ahead and discuss the flow of what it looks like to send an SMS using the REST API. So this is actually a gross simplification. The truth is there's probably 100 steps, but let's just talk about it at a high level. So first, your software is going to make an HTTP request to Twilio to send the SMS. And that's already not accurate. Like, what's really happening? Well, you're probably using a Twilio helper library, you're importing it into your software, and you're calling a method and passing some arguments. So the truth is, the first moment that something could go wrong could be in the helper library itself. Now, luckily, the helper libraries are incredibly thoroughly tested, so this is very, very unlikely. But it's possible. You have to consider it as a possibility. Once Twilio's helper library receives your method call with the arguments, it will then construct an HTTP request, and it will use a built-in HTTP client to make a request to Twilio over the public internet, the next place where things can go wrong. Anyone who deploys software to AWS or any cloud service understands that network partitions are things that can happen, and you simply have to account for them when you're building software. Assuming that Twilio receives the HTTP request, the next thing that it's going to do is it's going to authenticate the request. So you're making the request over SSL, and you're passing some credentials, and Twilio will validate that the credentials are valid. Once it validates the credentials, it will then pass this request to a downstream service that will validate the request itself. It'll check to see that you're passing the right parameters, that the values of those parameters are formatted properly, and so forth. Assuming everything passes, Twilio will then eventually hand off the text message itself to the carrier, and the carrier will hopefully deliver it to the handset of your end user. This is what happens, and at any stage, something could go wrong. So why don't we go ahead and write some code and illustrate what this looks like from a very simplistic perspective. So this is just a DigitalOcean VPS that I have spun up, and I'm going to create a very simple script called sendsms.js. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to require a module called .env. This just makes it really easier for me to load some environment variables. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to require the Twilio node helper library. I'm now going to use that helper library to instantiate a new REST client. And in order to do so, I have to pass some credentials. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out a Twilio API key and a Twilio API secret. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Twilio API keys? Wow. That's awesome. That's actually more people than I would have expected. Twilio API keys are relatively new. I believe they were launched maybe a year and a half ago. They are awesome, and I encourage all of you to use API keys. They are a full-on replacement for account SID and off-token authentication, with two important differences that are amazing. One, so I created an API key that I'm just called Signal London, but I can create as many API keys as I want. And if you work in a large enterprise or large organization, it can be very useful to create multiple API keys and provision them to different teams. The second characteristic of API keys that are also wonderful are that they are revocable. So you can give an API key to a team or a person, and if for any reason you think they were compromised, or you don't think that person or team should have access to your account anymore, you can simply revoke the API key. So they're incredibly useful, and they can do everything that an account SID and an auth token can do. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use this client to send a text message. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my account SID, access the messages resource, and create a new text message. And this is pretty simple. I'm going to send it to an argument that I'm going to pass in on the command line. I'm going to set the caller ID to another environment variable. And lastly, I just have to provide a body, which I think I'm going to say, need more coffee. I really desperately need more coffee. Cool. So this is pretty much the simplest script I can imagine writing. Let's go ahead and run it. And I'm going to send myself a text message. Boom, it worked, right? Which is fantastic. And you're probably asking yourself, that was easy. What's so hard about using the Twilio REST API? OK, well, imagine that you have built a web form, and you're asking people to give you a mobile number that you will use to send them a text message. This is an incredibly common use case. And some joker comes along, and they enter a phone number that looks like this. Trust me that this is an invalid phone number. Well, I'm going to go ahead and run my script, and my script executes fine. But I assure you that no text message got delivered. So I guess the real question is, if I wanted to make this slightly more production worthy, can anyone here tell me what I should instantly and immediately do? That's an awesome suggestion. I'm going to get to that. There's something even more basic. Lookup? Yes, I will use lookup to validate the phone number. But there's something even more basic, more fundamental. Sorry? Try catches? That's exactly right. In this case, the Twilio node library provides, so the key insight here is that Twilio is actually returning a response to my call to the REST API, and this code is dropping that response on the ground. And the response actually helpfully includes information about what might have gone wrong. So this is a mistake that far too many developers make, because of course we sort of test the happy case, and it works, and we move on to new things. So I'm going to simply add a small little event handler, and I'm going to print out the error should it happen, and I'm going to rerun this script. And boom, Twilio tells me exactly what I did wrong. It provides a status code and a message telling me what I did wrong. And this mistake is more common than you can possibly imagine. But this is still not really remotely robust enough to be something that you should put into production. So let me show you a slightly more complex version of the script that does a couple things that many of you mentioned. The first thing that I'm going to do actually, though, is require a module called rollbar. So rollbar is just a cloud-based log aggregation tool. And there are a dozen other tools that are very similar. But this is one that I'm familiar with. So I'm going to require the rollbar module, and I'm going to initialize it. The second thing that I'm going to do, which many of you mentioned, was that Twilio has a lookup API. So why would you bother trying to send a text message to a phone number if it's not a valid number, or if it's not a valid number that would accept a text message? So right here, I'm using the lookups API to look up this phone number, get back some carrier information, and then actually test to see if it's a mobile carrier. So let's go ahead and run this script and see exactly what kind of experience we have. So I'm going to go ahead and run it. I'm going to pass the bogus number that I used before. It executes. Now I can switch over here. I can go to my rollbar dashboard. And I now see that I have a log of what went wrong that's accessible to me and the members of my team. So this is a really awesome tool that I encourage you all to check out and use. Another tool that is a mainstay for many Twilio developers is the API Explorer. Can you raise your hand if you've ever used the API Explorer? Awesome. Definitely check it out. It's wonderful for prototyping and testing with the REST API. The API Explorer is pretty simple. It's a web-based interface to Twilio's REST API. And I'm actually really excited to announce today here at Signal London that we have just shipped a developer preview of a brand new API Explorer that is completely rewritten from the ground up and gives you all access to the entire suite of Twilio products and endpoints. And I'd love to show it to you right now. So log into the console and go to the API Explorer. And you'll see a banner at the top that says, check out the new developer preview. So if you go ahead and click on that, you'll then find yourself in the new API Explorer developer preview. And you will now have access to all of Twilio's products, including products that are in beta and preview. So for instance, IP messaging. You can see all of IP messaging's resources. You can click into one. You can see all of the endpoints for those resources. And creating an IP messaging service is as simple as filling in a friendly name for this form. Signal London rocks. This is making a real request to Twilio's REST API and giving you the exact output from the REST API. So this is an awesome tool. Definitely encourage you to check it out. If, for whatever reason, you need to return to the classic API Explorer, just click on this link right here in the upper right. All right, so let's leave the REST API behind us and move on to common webhook issues. I don't remember what my daughter Catherine is screaming about right now. In fact, it occurred to me that you're probably wondering why I have so many pictures of my children screaming. I'm worried about this. I'm not a bad guy. I think there was like a picture of a giant shark on this mural above her head, and I thought it'd be a funny picture, and it worked out here. I assure you, if I tried to explain webhook storage, she would probably start crying. So what does the typical flow of a webhook request look like? Well, you might not be surprised to know that it's almost the exact opposite of the flow of a request to the REST API. So somewhere out in the world, some poor lost soul takes out their cell phone and calls a Twilio number for help. Great. Their carrier then takes that call and routes it to Twilio through the super network. Twilio does a lookup of the phone number that's being dialed and finds the account that's associated with that phone number and the webhook, the voice request webhook that you've configured for that phone number, and makes an HTTP request to that webhook. Once again, we have this scary public internet thing that is more than happy to eat your request, or actually could eat Twilio's request. But assuming it makes it to your server, your server now will get a payload of information from Twilio, and will need to format a response to send back to Twilio. Does anyone here know how long your web server has to actually send a response to Twilio before Twilio just gives up and causes a timeout to happen? 15 seconds. Give that man a donut. 15 seconds. And you would think, in computing time, that's unbelievably generous. But timeouts happen all the time. And it's understandable. Twilio is making a request to your webhook. There's a lot of business logic that you might want to or need to execute in order to format that response to Twilio. But there's probably a lot of business logic that you don't need to execute before you return a response to Twilio. Things like logging some information to a database or other kinds of things. So you've got 15 seconds to respond. Assuming that you send a response to Twilio, Twilio will then validate that you've sent valid TWIML. Maybe you didn't. And assuming that the TWIML is valid, it will then start to execute that TWIML and create the voice experience for the end user. So once again, this is a simplification, and there are probably closer to like 50 steps. But this is pretty reasonable. So let's go ahead and prototype handling an incoming call. But instead of writing code, let's get started with TWIML bins, because that's another new product, another new tool that we rolled out recently. And it's great for prototyping. So TWIML bins are a way for you to create very simple static TWIML documents that you can use to prototype a use case. And assuming that you're happy with it, you can then convert it into some proper code. So I'm going to go ahead and create a TWIML app called the Twilio Announcement Hotline. And I'm going to go ahead and start writing some TWIML. Oh, and by the way, please, if you have a phone on you, go ahead and take it out right now. I'm going to ask you kindly to call a phone number in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to use the Trump voice. And what would Trump say? Programmable voice insights is gonna be huge. We have the best insights. No one has better insights than us, right? Sounds reasonable. Awesome, I'm done. I'm gonna go ahead and create this TWIML document. It's saved, and let's go ahead and switch over to my phone number configuration page. Hold on, wait for it. So now the next thing that I need to do is I've got this TWIML document, or this TWIML bin, and I need to configure this phone number. So I'm going to go ahead and select TWIML, and then I'm going to select the TWIML document that I just created, the Twilio Announcement Hotline. So now, if you could all do me a solid and call this number that you see on the screen. And I'm actually going to go ahead and play along, because I like playing along too. I'll go ahead and put this on speakerphone. Maybe you'll hear it. Ringtone, cool. Ah, that sucks. Geez, I worked at Twilio for almost 5 years. Why can't I write a TWIML application? This is super embarrassing. OK, well, I think most of you know why that failed, but let's play along a little bit, OK? So I'm in the console, and you might have noticed that the debugger notification badge is lit up red, right? That's us telling you that an error has occurred with your account. So OK, I'm intrigued. What happened? Let's go ahead and go to the debugger. So the debugger is a new tool that we launched at Signal San Francisco, and it shows all of the errors associated with your usage of the Twilio API. And as we can see, many of you, wow, thank you so much. This is awesome participation. Many of you called my number and an error occurred. What error happened? Huh, cool. So I can click into any one of these errors, and I get all of this information telling me precisely what went wrong with this webhook request. In this case, we can see that there's a document parse error. And if I scroll down, I can actually see the response that came back from Twilio itself. And of course, now things are starting to click with me. I'm starting to realize what my mistake was. I can actually even click a link right here in the debugger and go back to the TWIML bin that the error is associated with. And of course, as soon as this loads, had I been paying attention in the first place when I typed, TWIML bin told me that this TWIML was invalid. And of course, I'm sure most of you are completely clear with what I did wrong. I did not close my tags. That is a terrible rookie mistake. And there is no voice trump. It's sad, there should be a voice trump, but there just isn't a voice trump. There is voice Alice. So cool. So now like I've fixed my bug. I now have some valid TWIML. You could call it again and hear a funny message from a lovely young lady named Alice. So it's not quite as funny. But now we fixed the problem. So yeah, so the debugger is an awesome tool. It's definitely worth checking out. So I guess really what I want to leave you here are some best practices for building and best practices for debugging. So best practices for building Twilio applications. So if you're using the REST API, use API keys. There's virtually no reason not to, and some excellent reasons to use them. Inspect the response from Twilio and handle errors properly. Handling errors properly, by the way, isn't always that easy. So for instance, here's some trivia. If you use the lookups API to look up a phone number, like the bogus one that I provided, it will actually throw an exception, depending on your programming language of choice. If it's Ruby, it'll throw an exception. If it's Node, it will provide an error in your callback. Why? Because the Twilio REST API is actually returning a 404, right? 404 not found. So it's a very restful thing for Twilio to do, but the consequence in the helper library is that it will actually return an error or throw an exception. And you have to know that as a developer so that you can handle that case differently than other kinds of errors that indicate that the API itself is actually completely borked, or that you've passed very, very invalid parameters. And lastly, quickly prototype ideas with the API Explorer. Now that we have coverage across all of our products and all of our endpoints, it's a really great tool to play around with these APIs before you commit to writing code. Best practices for building with webhooks. Respond as quickly as possible. Defer unnecessary business logic. It sometimes means that you need to re-architect some of your application in order to respond faster, but it's necessary. One thing that I can suggest is oftentimes there is a REST API equivalent of returning TWML. So if there's something about how you process a webhook that precludes you from responding within 15 seconds, you can probably do the exact same thing with simply a subsequent request to the Twilio REST API. Set fallback handlers. How many people here use fallback handlers? All of you should use fallback handlers. So every single webhook in the Twilio platform that expects a synchronous response, voice request URL, SMS request URL, every single one of them has a fallback handler. So in the event that it calls your primary webhook and some kind of failure happens, there's another webhook that you can configure to function as a fallback. Now, I'll tell you what a lot of people do, which is wrong. They take their primary webhook and they cut and paste it into their fallback. Because they figure maybe it'll work the second time. That's not a good idea. And you should set your fallback handler to something it may be less functional for your end user, but it's more foolproof. And frankly, TWML bins are an excellent thing to use for your fallback handler. They're more or less guaranteed to work. And then once again, use TWML bins to quickly prototype solutions before you spend the time or the resources to implement them in code. Some best practices for debugging. Break the problem down. This is sage advice for debugging Twilio applications, but it's also just great advice for debugging anything, any kind of software that you're writing. Check for internet network connectivity issues. Basically, please let this be the first thing that you do before you start tearing into your code or contacting Twilio with a support ticket. I'd say my anecdotal experience is that at a bare minimum, 50% of problems that people run into boil down to some kind of network hiccup. So look into that first before you do anything else. And finally, there are several resources at your disposal that Twilio provides that you can use. Status.twilio.com in terms of the uptime of our services, the debugger, which I just showed you how to use, and any logging that the products you're using use. These are excellent takeaways in terms of debugging your Twilio applications effectively. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you so much. It was awesome to talk to you. And if you have any questions, I'll be here right after the talk.